This next set of notes will look at calculating standard deviation using a scientific calculator, as well as looking at calculating variance. So it's important to note that all calculators are a little bit different. I've chosen one of the most standard calculators that we find our students use. It's the Sharp EL531 XT, so the Sharp EL531 XT. Even another different Sharp model will be slightly different. If you're having problems, look at your instruction manual, or your instructor can answer questions during seminar or office hours. Okay, but hopefully this will get you started on how to use your calculator to find standard deviation. We'll start with population standard deviation, and then we'll move on to sample standard deviation. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how to put our calculator into stats mode. So for my Sharp calculator, I notice a mode button right here, and then it brings up a submenu, and option 1 is statistics. It gives me different options for statistics, and 0 lets me do single variable statistics, which is what we want to do now. So to switch to stats mode for my calculator, I go mode, then 0, 1. You can make a note in of how to do it in your calculator. Okay. As far as entering data goes for my calculator, the data is written right underneath the M+ button. If I press a number and press M+, it enters it into my data set. I can start building my data set. So for example, if I put in the data set that we calculated standard deviation for by hand on page 1, so it was 2, 4, 7, 8, I've entered in that data set. After I've entered in a value, it always tells me the total number of pieces entered in so far. So again, for my data set here, I enter data using M+. Now, in order to calculate population standard deviation, where I see the symbol, right, so I see the sigma symbol showing just in this blue-green color just above the 6 button. If I press alpha, which is also in that same color, and then press 6, that gives me my sigma button, my standard deviation, my population standard deviation calculation. If I press equals, it'll calculate for me, and notice it calculates out to that same value that we got manually. So for samples, or for population standard deviation on this particular Sharp calculator, I press alpha 6. Note, for some other calculators, you might see a sigma sub n button for population standard deviation, right? So that would be like a something that looks like that for population standard deviation, but that is not how it appears on the Sharp calculator. Okay. When our data set is entered, until I clear it, I can actually calculate other standard deviation or other statistical measures as well. So you might notice that above the 4, I see X bar, right? So even though it's a population data set, mean is the same whether it's for population or sample. Our calculator's using that symbol X bar for mean. If I put alpha 4 in and press equals, is giving me this mean for my data set. So alpha 4 in this particular calculator is how I get the mean. Okay, for sample standard deviation, I would use alpha 5. I notice above the 5, I see that just X button. And so that's my sample standard deviation. And again, notice how it comes out a little bit higher than my population standard deviation. Again, on other calculators, we might see sample standard deviation denoted as sigma n minus 1. I think that's on Casio. And the n minus 1 is referring to the n minus 1 in the sample standard deviation formula. Okay. Now that we've got that covered, we're going to go on. We're going to do a few other questions, but in order to do that, we need to know how to clear our information, because if I just press the regular clear, the memories doesn't disappear, because we might want to calculate several statistics for a data set. So the calculator automatically tries to store the data until you're done with it. And so for a sharp, how I can clear the data is I want to activate that CA button, that clear all button. So it's in orange above the mode. So I press second function mode, then my data is cleared. If I try and calculate the mean, it's giving me an error because there's no data entered yet. And if I start entering data again, if I start entering 4 and plus, my data set's back at 1. Okay? Again, to clear the memory, it's second function mode. Okay, we're just about ready to get started with a few practice questions. One more term to familiarize ourselves with before we move on to the practice, and that's variance. So variance is simply the standard deviation squared. There's no special button on your calculator for it. You're just going to calculate the standard deviation. So if you put your data in, and then we calculate the standard deviation. If I want the variance, I square it. And that gives me the variance for a population. The reason why we talk about variance is because the standard deviation formula has a square root in it, and the variance formula tends to be more a rational number instead of an irrational number, and it can terminate, and so it appears in some statistical formulas. We won't really use it much. We don't cite the units for variance because they don't match the data set. So I think that allows us to get started. There's 2 different practice sets here. Clear your memory on your calculator, pause the video, enter in the data sets, do set A first, check your answers, and then move on to B. Make sure that you use the right button depending on if it's population or sample, and again, clear the data between the questions. Okay, for the first example, the population standard deviation comes out to 0.746 centimeters, and the variance is as shown. Things to pay attention to: remember to use the right symbol. Remember to round to 2 more decimal places than your raw data. Include units for the standard deviation. Okay, now before you move on to the next question, remember to clear the data and adjust the button that you're using. The next question is sample standard deviation, and also remember to use the right symbols. Pause the video, do the calculation, check your answers. Okay, for practice question B, your sample standard deviation comes out to 2.92 milliliters. Remember to include your units. And then your variance comes out to 8.5. You don't need to use units here. Pay attention to the symbols. Okay, great work. One more application questions and they'll be ready to go and do the rest of the homework and then your next worksheet as well, assignment. So we have a scenario where we've got 2 forensic science technicians who are working with crime scene samples. The number of minutes needed to test each one of 5 samples was determined for the 2 technicians. Okay, because there was 5 samples total and each of the technicians has 5 values given, even though they're working with crime scene samples, it's a complete data set. And so this will count as a population data set when we're doing the work. Okay, and what I want you to do is for each of these technicians, calculate for the data sets the mean, range, standard deviation, variance, and then decide, based on those results, who would you hire and why. Support your decision using statistical evidence. So, step 1, do those calculations for each of the technicians. Okay, pause the video, check your answer when you're done, and then think about it based on those events and what the different measures tell us about the technician's performance. Who would you hire and why? Okay, so pause the video and give it a go. Okay, so the mean, range, standard deviation, and variance are shown for each of our technicians. Notice again that I've rounded the mean to 1 more decimal place than what was in our raw data, and the standard deviation I've rounded 2 more decimal places. The variance I've kept exact. Oops, and I included minutes in the variance for that second technician, and I shouldn't have done that. Okay, so now we've done the analysis of the raw data. We've got to make our decision and support it with the measures. So based on this information, who do we hire and why? Pause the video, think about it, and then check your answer. So here's one possible answer. I would hire Tech A. Both technicians are equally fast on average. We see this through their equal mean values. But Tech A was more consistent. We see this because there's less variation. Their variance, range, and standard deviation are all lower for Tech A than in Tech B. Their data is less spread out. We've said before that usual values are within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So for future analysis, Tech A could be expected to work at our conduct analysis in 4 to 11 minutes time, whereas Tech B would have an expected range of 0 to 17 minutes. Okay, I hope that helps. You should be ready to try your next worksheet. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to talk to your instructor, drop into their office hours, or even book in for tutoring. Okay, take care. We'll talk again soon.